Hello and welcome to The Long View, a podcast that takes a closer look at the games people play. The Long View is a proud member of the Dice Tower Network. Go to dicetower.com for a huge variety of podcasts to meet every gaming interest, as well as fantastic reviews, news, and commentary. The Dice Tower is a great clearinghouse for you to check out, and there's truly something there for everyone. So go to dicetower.com. The Long View is also proudly sponsored by GameSurplus.com. GameSurplus.com is your first and best choice for online board gaming purchases. Thor and his family have a fantastic selection and truly unbeatable customer service and prices. If you're looking to find a game and no one else seems to have it, shoot him an email. If anyone can, Thor will track it down for you and shoot you an email as soon as he's got it. GameSurplus.com has a stellar reputation for their fantastic customer service. So the next time you're looking to buy a game, go check out GameSurplus.com. And if you order from them, please be sure to tell them The Long View sent you. I also want to send out a special hello to my new local game store. That is the Gamer's Edge here in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. If you're in northeastern Pennsylvania or northern New Jersey, it's a hop, skip, and a jump away, right across Interstate 80, and get off at the Stroudsburg exit, and you will find the Gamer's Edge right there on Main Street. Impossible to miss, fantastic board game selection. There are now over 500 titles. They are showing just a wonderful dedication to board gaming and growing the board gaming hobby here in northeastern PA. They also have a full line of Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, comic books, video game space, you name it, they've got it. A large space, plenty of gaming tables, great lighting, and a wonderful friendly staff. That's the Gamer's Edge in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. Check them out the next time you're in the area. My name is Jeff Gamble. I'm the host of The Long View, and tonight I am very pleased to be joined once again by Eric Brocious. Eric has graciously agreed to come on the show with me this evening to talk about the Friedman Freeze classic of Power Grid. This is a game that we've talked a little bit about before on the show, and Eric indicated he'd like to give it more of a full kind of review and treatment, and I was only too happy to oblige. So, Eric, thank you very much for joining me on tonight's show. I look forward to talking with you about Power Grid.
Jeff, I'm glad to be on the show again. Power Grid is one of the games that I really enjoy.
Well, I'm really looking forward to talking with you about it because, you, Joe, and I actually did discuss Power Grid and Funkenschlag a little bit on a previous episode. And, that was when I kind of thought to myself, and you guys had suggested, well, maybe we should do a full episode on Power Grid. So I'm really looking forward to talking about that because it is a game that is still in my collection and that I still find myself pulling out and playing from time to time. Maybe not as much as I used to, but it is a game that continues to have an attraction for me. So I'm looking forward to talking about that with you. So one of the things that we do in every show, as you know, Eric, because you've been with me before, is we take a look at a year in gaming. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at the year 1994 with you. So if you're game for that, let's get ready to begin.
Sure. I think about 1994, it's sort of the end of an era for me in gaming. I moved up to Massachusetts and I met some people, and some of them were gamers, and we would play games. We might get together 3-4 times a year and play games, and I enjoyed doing that. I had, a family, my wife and I, and we had little kids. And all of a sudden in 1995, this game called Settlers of Catan came out, and it was like a complete sea change. And we played that dozens of times. I remember playing it with my son when he was too little to hold the cards in his hands, so we had to play with our cards face up on the table. But 1994 was the last year of the old style of games to me. I think to myself that, I wonder what life would have been like if I hadn't made that change in 1995. people talk sometimes on Board Game Geek or other places about old games, and then they say Dominion, and I think to myself, it's not an old game. It's not an old game unless it was released in 1994 or earlier. So in some sense, I see this year as the last year of old games. Settlers, to me, is the first new game. That's because I started gaming in 1964, I guess, but it's a different perspective.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad that you're going to have the chance to share that with us, because I was looking at the list of games here before we started recording the show this evening, and I was thinking to myself, oh my goodness, there's not too many here that I've played. There's not too many here that I really recognize. And yet, when I recorded with Martin Griffiths about 2 weeks ago, we did a show on Hanabi, which is a relatively new game, but it was one he wanted to talk about. And we looked at the year 1995. There were just tons of games in there. We had El Grande in there, and we had Settlers, and a couple of Kinesia games, and just tons and tons of games that I really recognized as being a person relatively, new to this hobby. And so I think you're, in many ways, just by looking at this list, absolutely right. I think a lot of the games that we think about as our games, if you want to call it that, are games that came from 1995 and later. And as I look back at 94, and then I kind of took a peek back at 93 and 92 and started really digging backwards, I started realizing that there really was this sort of critical mass moment, it appears, in 1995. So I'm really glad that you're bringing that kind of to my attention, and I'm sure to the attention of other people who have not been gaming as long as you have. I've been gaming for quite a while as well, but my direction was much more in role-playing when I was younger, and then a lot of the old Avalon Hill titles, games like Midway and Squad Leader and stuff like that. Those were the kind of games. And then I drifted out of the hobby for, probably almost 20 years before I came back to it. And by the time I came back, it was that post-1995 world. So, I think that you're going to have some really interesting perspectives, and I look forward to hearing that from you as we take a peek at games from 1994 and perhaps even earlier, if you have any kind of connections you'd like to share between some of these designs and the games that you were playing earlier in your sort of gaming hobby interest, your gaming life. So I'm looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to it too, Jeff.
So first off here, Eric, we have Robo Rally. This is a game that is actually, I believe, still in print. I think a new edition was just put out not too long ago, or it's in the works, one of the two. My memory is failing me a little bit. But this is one of the games that I believe was rather unique for its time in that it was a programmed movement game. And I think that this may have been one of the first of those programmed movement games where you are, sort of planning in advance how it is you want your piece to move in this game. I haven't actually played the game myself, so I don't really have any experience with it. Is this one you're familiar with? Am I correct that it was one of the first programmed movement games? What can you tell us about it, if anything?
Well, yes, I've played it probably nearly 20 times. The last time I talked to you, I don't remember exactly what year we were doing, but I had been recording all of my plays since that year. But that's not the case anymore for 1994. I started recording all my plays in 2002, and so I can't really tell you for some of these games exactly how often I've played them. But I've played Robo Rally 16 times since 1992.
Wow.
So since 2002.
Okay.
But I know I played it a few times before that. So probably about 20. One thing that struck me looking at this list, it's not surprising, of course, is the influence of Richard Garfield, who had just come out, I think, the previous year with Magic the Gathering. I'm probably an unusual person in that I've played exactly one game of Magic the Gathering in my life using a borrowed deck, and I thought, well, that was okay, but I'm not going to spend hundreds of dollars collecting cards to play that. But Robo Rally is another Richard Garfield game. I think of Robo Rally. I think of Filthy Rich, which is a Richard Garfield game that I really like. I also think of the recent King of Tokyo. And he's a brilliant, inventive designer, so it's not surprising that he came up with something like this that's different from almost everything that you might have seen before. I think people have copied Richard Garfield multiple times in the course of this hobby since 1993.
Absolutely.
You know, it first came out in an edition that was then expanded. There were lots of boards. They became out of print and hard to get, ridiculously expensive for some of them. I don't remember exactly how many years ago it was, but Hasbro came out with a new edition, and it was greatly simplified. It had, first of all, perhaps easier to follow graphics. It had fewer different boards. The original Robo Rally had this phantom robot rule for what happened when two robots were on the same space. And of course, the aficionados all loved that stuff, and some of them criticized the Hasbro version. But I have the Hasbro version. I don't have the old ones. I think the big contribution of the new version is that it strongly urged the players to play on very simple courses with few boards and few goal flags. It was sort of like a game of trying to tag various flags in order while the other robots are getting in your way. And people in the past would get all of those expansions and set up a giant board, and it would take 16 hours to play the game, and then everybody would wish they hadn't done it.
Right.
And, if you make two boards and you just race across them, or maybe you go across and back, and it takes you 90 minutes or 2 hours, it's an enjoyable game. If you don't really want to play it for 16 hours, it's good to have something that encourages you to avoid doing that. So I have a lot of fun with it. I love games where you're presented with a set of things and you have to do something with them. One of my favorite memories of this game is playing a game with my wife and my son and maybe my daughter. And, I'm dad, so they're all thinking that maybe they're going to beat me, but they're not sure. And I draw a hand of cards, and it's all straights. It's like a 3 straight ahead, a 2 straight ahead, another 2 straight ahead, a couple 1 straights aheads. And I look, and my robot is facing a pit that's about 7 spaces away from me. But I have nothing in my hand to program but straights. So I program straights, hoping somebody will knock me off. And, the first move I move straight toward the pit, and then the next move I move straight toward the pit. And I slowly and carefully march straight into the pit. And they were howling with laughter. And I could have been frustrated at the fact that the deck gave me a hand of all straights. But, that's going to happen once in 1,000 times, and it was just hilarious. I love the kind of the spontaneity and the need to improvise, and it's an enjoyable game to me.
It sounds like a lot of fun. I may have to give it a shot. I agree with you, without having ever played it, that it is one of those kinds of games that I think there can be too much of a good thing. I think sometimes expansions add bloat to the playtime and turn a game that really works quite well in the time frame it was originally designed for, and turn it into something that it begins to overstay its welcome. And it sounds like that's sort of what you're describing here, which is that originally the game was quite pleasant and a lot of fun, and then people kept adding expansion boards to it until you end up with these monster games of Robo Rally, which maybe except for the few people who were really dedicated to it and really just incredibly involved and intrigued by it, ended up being something that was probably, I would have been frustrated with it after a while. I don't think I could play a game like that for hours and hours and hours. So it sounds like if the new edition kind of simplified that a little bit, that might actually be one that would be fun to seek out and fun to give it a try to. So I appreciate you sharing those memories. And as a dad who plays with his kids, playing games, and I can totally identify with that story of yours. And yes, there's nothing more that kids like than beating up on dad. It's just something that every kid really just wants to do, and it sounds like they just let you beat up on yourself because of the way the cards were. And I'm sure that was a lot of fun and a great family memory for you. So thanks for sharing that with us.
You're welcome. A game like this with a little bit of luck allows those things to happen. It's not always the person with the greatest strategy that wins a game like this. It doesn't hurt to have strategy, but it doesn't always help either.
Exactly, right. And that kind of levels the playing field when you're playing with kids, and makes it more enjoyable, for everybody. Because, I know as a parent, now I've never been one that will intentionally throw a game plan for my kids. I might not go for the kill the way I would with an adult. I might kind of take a less optimal kind of move if I'm playing with one of my children, but I still do generally try to win. And I've always kind of felt that, I don't want to coddle the kids, and, they need to learn how to lose as well as learn how to win. I think that that's just, as a societal thing, something that we need to do a better job with is, winning graciously and losing gracefully. And so it also, I think, it really increases the value. I mean, I was just playing Netrunner with my daughter. My middle daughter has taken a shine to Netrunner, and she's really gotten quite good. And I'd say the first 4 or 5 times I played her, I beat her. And, I was trying to kind of help her and give her some hints and teach the game to her. But the last time we played, she finally beat me. And I know that was fun for her, because she knows that I didn't throw that game. That was something that she did herself. And so I think that when you get games like Robo Rally, where it's not really, necessarily high strategy, there's some luck involved there. Especially when you're playing with younger kids too, that's just great. That's one of the reasons I like King of Tokyo. You can't predict how those dice are going to go. And so the playing field is leveled, and you don't have to feel like you're throwing the game to be nice to the kids, and the kids can go for you, but they don't always get the rolls they want. And those kind of games are really a lot of fun, and I enjoy them. So I'm glad that we got a chance to talk about it, and I may have to actually try and seek a copy of that out. Next on the list here, Eric, is a game called Category 5. This is a game I've heard quite a lot about. It's a card game, but I've never had the chance to play it. But I understand there have been spin-offs of this game. Is this one a card game that you're familiar with from 1994, or is this one that you didn't get a chance to play either?
No, I'm quite familiar with it, although I don't think I played it in 1994. I've played it 44 times since I started recording plays,
wow,
and a bunch of times before that. My son is a big fan of it. I should say that the name most people use for this game is Six Nimmt, which is a German name, which means the sixth takes. And it's a simple game. You've got cards with numbers on them. In the original Six Nimmt, the cards are the heads of cows. And it's a game where, sort of like Hearts, you don't want to take points. Here, you don't want to take cow heads. And you're trying to maneuver so as not to take cow heads. It's a game where each player has a hand of cards with numbers on them, and each card has a different number of cow heads. And you simultaneously, secretly all choose a card from your hand, and then you reveal them, and there's an algorithm that determines kind of how it works. And, you can't completely plan because you don't know what cards they're going to play, and there's some perhaps double bluffing, but also you don't know what cards they have. But skill matters. Some people say that you can play it randomly and win. I don't think that's really true very often unless your opponents are pretty bad. But it has been reissued in the Category 5, where instead of taking bullheads, you're taking hurricane flags. I'm a insurance person, so hurricane flags kind of fit in, but I'm not sure how many people are that excited about hurricane flags compared to cow heads. It's just no comparison.
I don't know. Cow heads, I think I'm more attracted to the hurricane flags than cow heads. If
it's the same game either way.
Right, exactly.
But the other thing about this game is it takes up to 10 people, and it's a simultaneous play game. So if you have 8, 9, 10 people, and for some reason they all want to play a game together, which you know how it is with casual gamers, often that's what they want. You can pull out Six Nimmt and play a game in 30 minutes. If people have no idea what to do, they can randomly play a card, and it's okay. I was just listening this week to another podcast where they were talking, I think it was Mark Johnson maybe, they were talking about what games you could play with non-gamers. And this game immediately came to my mind. Everybody can have a good time. You play a card. You might get cow heads or you don't. Everybody has a laugh about it. And if you don't have much strategy, you don't feel like you're sticking out in the crowd.
Fantastic. Well, I wasn't aware that it played with that many people, so I think that's one that, I'll have to try and check it out in one of the incarnations. Now, if you can answer one question for me, I'm not sure if you can or not, but I have a suspicion you can. So you said Category 5 was a retheme of 6 Nimmt. Wasn't there also like a 8 Nimmt, and like there's different sort of numbers that I've heard bandied about with that title? Have there been multiple versions of the game, and if so, do you know what the differences are between them?
Well, there is a game called 11 Nimmt, which is a different game.
That must be
But
it,
I think 6 Nimmt has been rethemed more than once. I don't think Category 5 is the only one. I don't have Board Game Geek open, but I think if you looked at the 6 Nimmt page or the Category 5 page, they'd probably list all the alternate names that it has.
Well, I can do that.
It's just a little card game in a little box. It's the kind of thing that, maybe in Europe and Germany, it's the thing that might be hanging up next to the cash register in your local grocery store. I don't know.
Right.
But, it kind of has one of those hang tabs that'll hang on one of those little metal, holders for little objects. And probably in Germany, it costs €5 or €6. I don't think I paid very much for my copy either.
Well, this is really interesting, Eric, because it says that it was re-implemented by a game called Slide 5, and more recently, the Walking Dead card game, which I actually have heard quite a few people say that the Walking Dead card game is a pretty good game, and it's much better than the board game, and maybe that's why. Maybe this Walking Dead card game takes the engine of 6 Nimmt and does something different with it, with a different theme. So I would be, because I know you can get that game. That game is readily available. Because when I look at the game page here for Category 5, there's no listings that it's available for sale anywhere. And when I cross back over to 6 Nimmt and I scroll down, I see there's all sorts of different rethemes, Bullen Party and Slide 5, Take 5, but none of those really seem to be available for sale either, other than 11 Nimmt, which you said was kind of a different game. So I appreciate you kind of clarifying that for me, because the game's been around for a while and it's been re-implemented many, many times, which usually is a decent indication that you have a good game. There's something to it if it's been reprinted and redone that many times.
I agree. It's a good game, and I think Walking Dead card game is actually 6 Nimmt with special powers.
Oh, well, that would sound like even more fun, so...
Yep.
All right. Next on the list here is a game I have no experience with whatsoever, so it's all you if you've played it, and that's Blood Bowl 3rd Edition.
Well, I'm not really too fond of the approach that the publisher takes toward their customers, so I try to act as if that game doesn't exist.
Okay, all right, and I think I know which publisher you're talking about, and we will just let that lie there. I don't have any experience with it, so I can't really speak intelligently about it, and I don't even really know the first question to ask. I do know that the game was sort of re-implemented as Blood Bowl Team Manager, which I believe is a Fantasy Flight title, which is sort of a card game version of Blood Bowl, and I have played that, and that was kind of cute. I don't really buy into the theme. Me personally, it's like, okay, so orcs are playing football with elves or whatever. I don't know. It didn't really work for me. I thought some of the mechanisms of the game were interesting, but I never actually played the parent game, Blood Bowl, so I don't have anything to say about it either. One that I'd like to kind of skip to here on the list is a game called I'm the Boss. And that's because that is a game I actually do have some experience with. It is a game that, interestingly enough, even though it came out in 1994, I just bought that game 2 years ago at the WBC from a dealer in the dealer hall there, and we had a blast with this game. I mean, this is an old Sid Saxon title, and again, it's one of those sort of older games where there are very few rules. It's pretty straightforward, very easy to play. And, this is a game that I find still holds up very well today. It is a game, however, that is very dependent on the people that you're playing with. That human element is extremely important. If you're playing with the right group of people, it's a great, raucous, fun time, lots of wheeling and dealing, table trash talk. If you're playing with people who aren't interested in bargaining or dealing and just kind of want to, play it sort of straight, it's nowhere near as much fun. But I don't know that that's necessarily the fault of the game. I think that would be just playing the game with the wrong group of people. When you play it in the spirit that I think it was designed in by Sid Sackson, I think it's just a fantastic game that still holds up today. It's one I still have in my collection, and one that I think I'm going to continue to have in my collection. My kids still request playing it. Have you played this game? Do you have experience with that one as well?
Yeah, I've played it 2 or 3 times. I played it soon after it came out. I guess I'm the type of person that ruins the game. It's just too much of a temptation to be analytical about it, and then, it degenerates into a big mess. You need people who are able to be more spontaneous. Maybe if I were in a group where everybody else was being spontaneous, I could fit in, but you get a bunch of people like me, it's just a disaster, that game. I have a lot of respect, I have to say, for Sid Sackson. And in 1994, he was one of the biggest names. We hadn't heard of Reiner Knizia or any of those other people too much.
Right.
But, it just kind of irritated me. But I agree with you. I recognize that's my problem, not the game's problem.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think if you were playing with people who are in that spirit, I think it would carry you along. You'd be buoyed by it and sort of carry along with the current. But as I know a little bit about you, and I know you have a very fine, kind of keen, analytical mind. You're a numbers guy. I could see this, you and other players who have that kind of analytical nature really being able to sort of math out what is really the optimal deal that I could make here, and I'm not interested because if I do this, then my return on that investment is not going to be enough to justify. And I think you're right. I think it could bog down. Is that kind of what you're talking about, where you're able to kind of do the math for that and figure it out, and that kind of takes a little bit of the enjoyment out for you?
Yeah, and if I have an I'm the boss card, then I want to wait until you play your I'm the boss card so that I can trump yours. But you want to wait until I play my I'm the boss card, and so it's this waiting match, and it just doesn't fit with me.
So it's chicken where no one actually ever blinks, and so you just kind of stare at each other. Okay, all right, I understand. Well, I think it just goes to show that there's such a great variety of kind of games out there. There's negotiation games like I'm the Boss, and then there are other games like the one that I kind of bleeped over in order to get to I'm the Boss, which is Kingdoms. Now, this is a game that I have not played, but I've heard quite a bit about it, and I think it was just reissued again as a brand new reprint. Have you played Kingdoms?
I think the original name was Alfheller und Pfennig. That's a Knizia game, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I think you know how it is with his games. He will take the same thing and re-theme it 20 times. I thought it was way too calculational for me. It was putting numbers down in a grid, and I played it at least once or twice, but oddly enough, for a math guy, if a game is all math, I don't want to play it.
Interesting. Maybe too much like work?
Yeah, it's like I want decisions that depend on uncertainty more than this one does. And I guess there's uncertainty, but somehow this one just didn't do it for me.
Okay, all right. Well, I don't really have any experience with it, unfortunately, so I have to kind of pass that conversation by. But I appreciate you, sharing your recollections and letting us know what it was that didn't work for you. I don't think anybody would be surprised to hear that, as you said, it's a Knizia game that's mathy. That's kind of his calling card in many ways. So that's something that doesn't surprise me to hear about that game. There's a couple others that are on this list that I would like to just bring up briefly, and then if there's any others that you saw that you would like to bring up, I'd be happy to hear about those as well, of course. The first one that I see here is called We the People. Now, We the People was, I believe, Mark Herman. I'm going to kind of click on it here and go back and make sure that I'm
That's right.
getting that
Mark
correct.
Herman.
Yes, Mark Herman was the designer. And this game is sort of famously re-implemented as Washington's War. The original We the People is a game that I had tried mightily to get back before Washington's War was released. Once Washington's War was released, of course, then the price for this came down quite considerably. But I never actually had a chance to play it. So I was curious if you had had the chance to play We the People and what you would say about this old Avalon Hill title and how it compares to the newer implementation of Washington's War.
Well, I have played We the People 3 times. I have not played Washington's War. The first thing I have to say is that Mark Herman is a genius. And this is the start of a whole family of games, the card-driven war games. People often think any game that's a war game with cards is a card-driven war game. But in some sense, he came up with a way of representing a conflict that no one else had thought of before, and it really worked. And I really like some card-driven war games. My favorite is Paths of Glory, but I also like Twilight Struggle. Eventually, I decided We the People just didn't have enough going on to be interesting to me. But that's part of the point that the American Revolution, you had 2 armies contesting North America for 7 years, and yet remarkably little happened. You know, the British would sit in Boston or New York, and they wouldn't go anywhere. They would just sit there for month after month, and nothing would happen. And if you were a gamer, you would never have your army sit there. And Mark had to think about how you would represent a conflict in which nothing happened for long periods of time. And so he came up with the idea of these cards and these event cards, and sometimes you just wouldn't have a card that would do you any good, so you might just have to discard cards because you had nothing to do. And as a result, the game actually plays in many ways very similarly to how the American Revolution actually played out. And it's brilliant, but it's not a game I want to keep playing over and over again. I want to learn some other card-driven war games, but that one I don't think I want to come back to. The other notable feature of this game and Washington's War is that they are much simpler than many of the other card-driven war games, so they were a good entry point. But I think today, if someone wanted to get into the genre, I'd suggest that they start with Twilight Struggle, which is, if anything, a little bit simpler, and it's the #1 game on Board Game Geek. So, even that role as the entry point to the genre has in some ways been supplanted by Twilight Struggle.
It's interesting to hear you talk about that, the nature of the conflict of the American Revolution, because, of course, you're correct. It was a war that was very long and protracted, but there were very few large-scale engagements. Of course, this was a time in history when we still basically wintered, when troops would kind of just go to their winter quarters and nothing really happened. And that was because it was impossible to move large numbers of men and artillery and supplies in the spring and in the winter, when either you had flooding and mud, or you had snow and ice. It just really wasn't conducive to conducting war. And so there were large chunks of time in which nothing happened, as you described. Also, you have a commander of the Continental Army in Washington who had learned very quickly that the absolute worst thing for him to do would be to try to go toe-to-toe in an engagement with the British Army. He spent most of his time trying to avoid large-scale engagements because that wasn't really going to work for him, and he knew that. And so you had a conflict that was a lot of maneuvering, a lot of feinting, but not a whole lot of direct conflict, as you said, not too many large-scale battles. So I think that I know Washington's War simulates that very well. I know that, the things about Washington's War that stood out to me were, again, as you said, the card play, the events that are depicted in the cards, and it had sort of picked up on that idea of, sometimes you don't have the cards that you need to activate the troops that you would like to get them to move. So in other words, there might be an opening, but you can't seem to get your troops mustered and your leadership ready and moving in a time frame that's going to be advantageous for you. So there is that level of frustration that you feel in that game. I also think Washington's War is notable in the same way that you do for the barrier of entry, which was quite low because it had a very simple point-to-point movement system. We didn't have charts and tables we had to consult regarding terrain. It was relatively straightforward as far as the movement and the mechanisms of the game go. So I agree with you that I think that this idea of these card-driven games was truly brilliant. And I know that I enjoy just as much as you do Twilight Struggle and games of that nature. I desperately want to play Paths of Glory, but I just haven't been able to find anybody to play it with. And, it's a style of game that I really enjoy. And, it's funny because you talked about how Mark Herman kind of came up with this idea to simulate this type of conflict. And in many ways, I feel that Valko Ruhnke has done that with the Coin series. I think that he has found a way in game terms to make a counterinsurgency style of conflict something that you can actually simulate in a board game to a degree. And I think he's been very successful with that system. And I think that personally, I talked about this in the episode I did about the Coin series. I think that that's really kind of the next step in war game design, in the same way that Mark Herman kind of got that whole ball rolling with this card-driven sort of system that was used for this. I think and so many other games that we could point to that use that. GMT's catalog is just full of games that are these sort of card-driven war games, whether it's Unhappy King Charles or all of these other kinds of games that are using that kind of engine. So thanks for sharing your thoughts about that earlier design, because I didn't have a chance to play that one. So I'm glad I had a chance to talk with you about it.
If you wanted to teach American Revolution, I don't know if you do that in your class. One of those two games might even be a potential class exercise because it's not that complicated.
Yes, I've used actually Washington's War in order to do that. And when I recorded with Brian Mayer, when we were discussing his game, Freedom, the Underground Railroad, and also talking about using games in the classroom, that game came up. Because, normally children, students, or even adults, reading about this battle or that battle or this time period of the war, it's very dry. It's battle maps and dates and things. But when you set that up on a game board, or you set up that kind of scenario, okay, here's going to be Washington trying to escape New York, and then you have the students play it out and say, okay, what would you have done here? What would have been your choices? And I had half of my class split up playing the British side and half playing the colonist side. And you could just see instantly how much more engaged they were with not only the game but the history, because as soon as they did what they wanted to do, then they came back and said, well what happened? What really happened? What did they do? And then as you're kind of going over it with them and talking to them about it, they're making all these connections, and you can see them saying, okay, that was smart, or, oh, why did he do that? Or, how come he didn't, chase him here? And so it started that whole dialogue with the students that made it really come alive for them in a way that your standard kind of textbook and videos just can't do. So I agree with you 100% on that. And it's something that I hope we're going to see more and more of in education as we move forward. It is very clear that students nowadays like to learn and enjoy gaming. And so if we can bring some of that in, it's going to automatically, I think, increase student engagement and help them relate to what it is that they're learning in a way that traditional methods seem to be failing at this particular point in time. I think just, kids are just wired a little differently now than they used to be. But that's, a whole nother topic. So, Eric, the last one here that I wanted to bring up was a game called Manhattan. This is one that I have thought about for a while. I've seen every once in a while. I've almost pulled the trigger on buying it a couple of times, if for no other reason than I believe it kind of makes like a three-dimensional sort of map, a city where, buildings actually are rising up on the game board. And this was done by, I believe, the same designer who did Puerto Rico, Andreas Seyferth, I think. He did Manhattan here as well. And this is one of those games of his, like airships, that I think a lot of people kind of missed. What can you tell me about Manhattan? Because it was a very highly regarded game, but it just doesn't seem to be around as much anymore.
Yeah, I've only played it once. I enjoyed my one play. You're right, it's geometrical. It's kind of cool. You get these cards that give you shapes that you can deal with. I enjoyed it. I didn't enjoy it enough to go seek it out. If somebody else wanted to play it again, I would cheerfully do it. The only other thing I can tell you is apparently there is a version or variant that has Godzilla in it. So you buy yourself a plastic Godzilla, and he stomps around the city and knocks things over as you build them. I don't even know how the rules go, but that sounds like a cool thing.
Yes, it does, yeah. I would have to say that would probably sell me on that game. So, all right. Well, I appreciate you letting me know about your play of that. And the three-dimensional that you mentioned is something that I really like. It's just there's a geek factor for me about that. These games where you're actually kind of building something and it has that three-dimensional space to it. Eric, we could go on and on for a little while here and talk about other games, but unless there's one that you particularly wanted to talk about, I thought we could wrap this up unless you had some other thoughts about maybe the differences between these 1994 and earlier games and this sort of seismic shift that happened that you're describing in 1995 with Settlers. Is there anything else you wanted to sort of touch on?
Well, I would mention one more game. It's a game by Friedemann Friese, who's also the designer of Power Grid. I don't think I knew about him at the time, but, all his games seem to have F's in the titles.
Yes.
And he designed a game in 1994 called Falsche 50er, which is German, of course has F's. You could, in English, call it Fake 50s. And it's a really cool game. I don't think it's a very common game, but in that game, each of the players is counterfeit money, people who are trying to pass counterfeit money. And you have to buy counterfeiting machines, and then you print your bills, and then, you can't just spend counterfeit money if it's real money. People get suspicious, so you have to find a way to kind of fence it. And I remember one of the tricky things about the game is that the people that sell counterfeit money-making machines won't take counterfeit money. Kind of makes sense, right? They can spot it.
Absolutely.
And so it's an auction game. It's very counterintuitive. We played it. The last time we played it, my wife won. And, she doesn't win a lot of games that are auction games. She was thrilled. She just kind of thought about it the right way and maybe got a little lucky, but she had some good strategy. I think that's maybe one of the earliest Friedemann Friese games that I know of that I really like. I haven't gotten to play it that often because it's so wacky that some people kind of turn up their noses at it. But Fake 50s. It's also a game that has money in it. And, there's ones and twos and fives and tens. And then there's a single $213 coin, which, only Friedemann Friese would put a $213 coin in a game. So I just felt like I had to mention that. But I think I would say more generally that, in some sense, when you started in 1995 and you had games like Medici and Settlers of Catan, these were games that were really the classic Euro games. They were stripped down. All of the surplus mechanisms were taken off. The games in 1994 and before tended to be more tightly tied to their settings and have less streamlined rules. If we look at all the ones we talked about, they all kind of have some complexities in the rules that are designed sometimes very effectively to reflect the setting in which they operate. And certainly I love some of those games. 3 or 4 of my very favorite games come from 1995. But I think a lot of people, including me, realizes that we lost something a little bit. It's nice to have a variety of games. And probably more recently, that feeling of a little bit more mechanisms to support the setting has come back. I'm not sure that all of the modern games do it as well as some of the really good games from 1994 and the years before that. But it's an evolving hobby, and who knows what's going to happen next year.
Well, I think you're right in that everything that's old is new again, in that I think the pendulum always kind of swings. You see that a lot in any field of endeavor, and I think that you're right that some of these thematic sort of rules and exceptions and complexities that are designed to be true to a time or a place were sort of stripped away in that first wave of Euro games, and in some respects are still stripped away. I mean, I look at some of my favorite games, which are Stefan Feld games, and most of those are not very thematic. That they really don't have that. I just finished recording an episode with Martin Griffiths, and we reviewed the game Palaces of Carrera, which really feels like an old school 1995-97 Euro game, really does. And it's a really fine game, but again, the theme, pretty much non-existent. It really isn't there at all, and there's no real nods that are given to the time or the place. It's just kind of there. And so I think you're right. I think that maybe there's a little something that's been lost there. But then, I also see some new game designs that are trying to, I think, harken back to that. One of the ones that I'm thinking of in particular is Robinson Crusoe. That game is just full of interesting design choices that really particularly make you feel tied to that particular location and that particular theme. Not only does it do it in a mechanical way, but it also does a fantastic job of evoking it in an emotional way as you play the game. So, I think that there are definitely some signs that we're moving back a little bit towards that feel. And yet, I think the really good designs, the ones that are standing out to me, Eric, are the ones that are going back to that sort of integration of the theme, but without getting too bogged down in minutia. And that, I think, is a good thing. So it's kind of taking the best of the Euro movement and the best of the older designs that were much more concerned with being tightly thematic and true to the location and the time or the theme, and integrating them in a way that is, quite frankly, at least in my opinion, better. So I'm kind of glad to see that these two sort of disparate areas that you're talking about are coming together, at least I think, in my opinion, a little bit more strongly and with a little bit more success in some of the modern games. And I think that's a reflection of people looking back at what was really successful and really intriguing and engaging about older games, and also looking at all of the new things that have happened in the past 20 years and trying to sort of marry those two into something that is going to be different and something that's going to be greater than the original ideas, until they were mashed together. Now, that doesn't always work. There's been plenty of designs I can think of that have tried that and failed. But I think that one of the good things about the huge explosion in just the sheer number of board games that we've been seeing is that when you throw that many darts at the board, someone's gonna hit it, and I think that there are games out there that are hitting that mark and really elevating themselves into something new. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts about 1994 and previous and post, and your perspective as a gamer who's been in this hobby for quite some time. I am always happy to talk to someone who has more experience than I do, and so I appreciate you are taking the time and sharing that with us. So thanks for all of that, Eric.
You're welcome.
So tonight, Eric and I are going to have the chance to talk to you about Power Grid. Power Grid is a game designed by Friedman Freeze. It plays with 2 to 6 players. It was originally published in 2004 in this incarnation. Before that, the game was released as Funkenschlag, and the games are not entirely the same, as I'm sure Eric will be happy to explain to us a little bit later. But most of us here in the United States, at least, are very familiar with Power Grid. It is a game that has been around for quite some time. It is a game that has been expanded seemingly continuously by new maps and new tweaks to the rule sets, new challenges, new markets. So it's a game that has remained sort of in circulation and in the forefront for quite some time. I would characterize this game as an auction game, and I would also characterize it as an economic game with a simply brilliant market system. These are the things, when I think about Power Grid, that really jump out to my mind. I first played the game, I would say, probably about 5-6 years ago, and really enjoyed my plays of it. I do not particularly feel it plays well with 2 players, although I have had some enjoyable games with the Italy expansion map because it's such a tight map. But generally I find that the game shines at a higher player count, and I'll be curious to hear what Eric has to say about that a little bit later. I found the game to be a little bit difficult to set up. There's a little bit of deck building that you have to do in order to get the power plant deck ready. There are some distinct phases in the game that you need to be aware of as you shift from one phase to the other during the course of gameplay, which can be a little tricky, especially for new players. But the overall flow of the game is rather simple. There's going to be a set of power plants that are available for auction at the start of every round. The players are going to be able to bid on these power plants, and the power plants in general get better as the game goes on. As technology improves and time marches forward, you get better and better power plants, better being measured by either the amount of fuel that they need to consume in order to produce their electricity, or better in the fact that they are cleaner and more efficient and maybe can power more areas than an earlier power plant. So there's this sort of natural evolution of the power plants as the game goes on. You have a pressure on you to upgrade your power plants because you're only allowed to have so many during the course of the game at any one given time. And then there's this wonderful market mechanic. The available resources for the power plants to use are, of course, basically oil, coal, recyclables such as garbage, kind of depicted by these little yellow cylinders, trash. And then you also, of course, have nuclear power that is available, but quite expensive. So finally, later in the game, you get into renewables, wind power and solar power and things of that nature. So the game really does a nice job of sort of modeling the evolution of technology and power plants but it also creates this wonderful tension in the game as people are maneuvering to gain power plants, not only that are going to be effective for them in how many areas that they can power with that particular power plant in order to make money, in order to make a profit so they can try to win the game, but also it does a great job of simulating the supply and demand as resources are bought from the market. Of course, those resources become more rare and they become more expensive. And this very simple supply and demand system that I saw in this game was really the first time I'd ever seen anything like that. I have since seen it in games such as Navigador by Matt Gertz and things of that nature, but this is the first game that I can think of that had a market system like that just so elegantly simulated supply and demand. So my first impressions of the game were it was really interesting, very compelling, a little difficult to set up and get into, but once the game started playing, was really enjoyable. I'll save some of my opinions about sort of how the game plays in the mid-game and late game towards the end, because I want to give Eric, of course, a chance as my guest to chime in and tell us how he came in contact with this game. But I just wanted to kind of share my initial impressions of Power Grid, and why I think it's a game that has stuck around for so long is because of those elements of the design and the expandability and the expansions that have been added to the game. So that's kind of my story with Power Grid. And Eric, I'm wondering if you can share with us when you first came in contact with the game and what your first impressions were and what you find compelling or unique about it.
I first became acquainted with its predecessor, Funkenschlag, which is a more complicated and longer version of Power Grid. I think I learned about it on a website that was a predecessor to Board Game Geek called Spielfreaks. People were talking about this new game. It wasn't too easy to get. I think Friedman sort of self-published it, so I had to find a way to get a copy. I don't remember where I got it. I remember in particular that some of the components didn't actually fit in the box, and I thought, that's irritating. You got a box, and the components don't fit in it. I'm sure it's just because Friedman was sort of publishing on a bit of a shoestring. If you get a copy of various Friedemann Friese games, you'll find that the very earliest ones were kind of crude, although extremely innovative. And the modern ones, of course, are up to the full standards of anybody who would publish games. But I got a copy of Funkenschlag, and I played it. It was kind of long. I know Joe Huber, who I've recorded a podcast with before, really prefers the original one. It may be that because he can play games twice as fast as everyone else, the length doesn't bother him as much. But I played that a handful of times. Maybe I played it 5 or 6 times between 2001 and 2004. And then in 2004, I attended the Gathering of Friends, which is a gathering, invitational gathering that happens every April. And Friedemann was there, and he was demonstrating this game. And, I loved it right away. And, I recognized that there were some features of the old game that weren't there anymore, but this one was easier, it was faster, and I immediately thought that the general people that I played games with will play this game, whereas I can't really get them to play Funkenschlag. So, if you give me 2 games and one I can get people to play and the other one I can't get people to play, I'm going to go with the one I can get people to play every time.
Absolutely.
The other thing I would say is it's really a very intuitive game. People talk about how it's not realistic, and I've taught this game a lot of times to a lot of people. And I tell people, in this game, you are managing an electric utility in Germany. And in Germany, it's not considered right for people running an electric utility to be aiming to get rich. Your goal is to serve the public. And to serve the public, you got to deliver power to cities. So the winner of this game is going to be the person that powers the most cities at the end of the game. So I tell people that, and people all understand that. And then I say, well, to power cities, you got to buy power plants, and you got to buy fuel to run the power plants, and then you've got to connect up the cities so you can deliver the power to them. And that's what we're going to do in this game. And I found that not just strategy gamers, but a lot of people can understand that. Even people that are sort of casual gamers understand what the game is about. Now, a lot of people who are in the game hobby realize how difficult it is to play this game well, and they think it's a complicated game. And the answer is, if you want to play at the absolute top level, there's a lot of things you have to think about. But just to play it, it's pretty accessible. So that's a nice thing about it. It's accessible. It makes sense what you're trying to do. It's a little nice that with so many economic games where the goal is to be the richest player at the end, in this game, money's only a tiebreaker, right? So it's kind of a little switch. You kind of have to use money to achieve what you're trying to achieve, but it doesn't win the game for you. So those are some of my initial thoughts. And, the first week I played this at that event, I bet I played it 5 or 6 times because I really liked it. And, of course, they had, even in the first game, 2 different boards. You could have the U.S. board on one side and the Germany board on the other. Probably those were the 2 big gaming markets. But Friedman's done a great job of bringing out new maps. And you might say a map in itself is not much of a change, but each map had a few little tweaks to it that changed the rules in what seemed like a minor way, but had the effect that if you really knew how to play the game with the old version, you had to think of new strategies when you wanted to play with this new map. And so maybe gave the new players a chance, if they were playing a new map, that they would be able to compete on a more even footing with the experienced players, because nobody played with these exact rules on this map before.
Yeah, that is something that I think is a real benefit of the game, something that I think has contributed to its success. I like the fact that, as you said, it's not just a map, but it's also usually a change in either how your routes are being built, the types of power plants that may or may not be available, but most often it's a tweak to the market. It's a tweak to the supply of coal and oil and nuclear and recyclables, etc. And that leads to totally different sort of tensions in the game and new decision points, which is what you're talking about. And I wholeheartedly agree with you on that. I do think, though, that you can't underestimate the importance of money in this game. I understand that it is not what wins you the game, but it is often what is going to allow you to get the power plants that will win you the game. And so every time that I've played it, the economy of the game, the money in the game, the amount of profit that you're able to make from supplying your cities with power is really crucial in order to set yourself up for future auctions, because the way the game works at its heart is, as soon as someone, I believe, it's been a little while since I played, Eric, so correct me if I'm wrong, but as soon as someone is able to power at least 15 cities, that is going to signal the end of the game. That does not mean that someone behind the player who powered the 15th city can't come and power 17 cities, maybe on their last turn, and they can win the game. But, so I understand that it's actually delivering the power that wins you the game and not the cash on hand. But I have played the game, enough times to know that the money aspect of the game is quite important. So the money that you have to pay in order to buy the power plants, the money that you have to pay in order to supply them. There have been many times, for example, that I have sadly gone with a really dirty coal plant because everyone else is in oil. And so, this coal plant might require a bunch of coal and not look very efficient, given that it's only going to power 4 cities. However, coal is really cheap because no one else is really in the coal game. No one's really interested in the coal game. So in the short term, it's going to be much more. It's going to be much more advantageous for me to be the guy in coal and get my fuel cheaply, and then to compete with everybody else for, say, oil or nuclear or whatever it might happen to be. And so there's definitely some economic decisions and considerations that you have to make. Now, I'm not claiming that you're saying there's not. I understand that you're saying that's not what wins you the game. But would you say I'm overstating the importance of money during the game?
Well, first, I would say that to end the game, you build a number of cities. It could be 15, 17, 14. It depends on the number of players. It's not powering the cities. If you're in a game where it takes 15 cities to end it, in theory, you could build 15 and power 12 and win the game, because building to 15 ends it, and if nobody else can power 12, you win it. That's just a clarification.
Right.
But I would say if I'm at a convention or a place where people are gaming and I see a group of people playing Power Grid, and it's one of my favorite games, so I might walk over to the table to see how it's going, the first thing that I'm going to look at is what power plants everybody owns. So I'm not going to ask how much cash they have. That's important. I'm not going to ask what cities have they built. I'm going to say to myself, what power plants does everyone own? And that's my number one sort of criterion to determine who's doing better or worse. It certainly is possible you could have better power plants and have such a poor money situation or such a poor city situation that you're in big trouble. But the easiest way to fail in this game is to fail to purchase power plants that you need to power enough cities to win. And it's the only thing that cannot be solved with money. I can't tell you how many games I've played where somebody's got $243 piled up, or electros, I guess is the currency in Power Grid, and the power plant market is full of crap, and you could just see the steam coming off their head as they say, "I've got all this money, take my money, please." And all there is that 14 garbage plant that powers 2 cities, and it's useless to them. And so I think that this is a brilliant design. Friedman is a great designer, and one of the most brilliant parts of it is the fact that that power plant purchase decision, sure, there's an auction, but you have to have a plant to buy. And it's a risk management game, because if only you and I are left in the auction and there's a really good plant and we bid it up to 50 and we keep bidding, I have to think to myself that there's a risk here. I could keep bidding and spend a lot of money, and then the plant that flips off to replace it might be another good plant, and you get it for list price. Mm-hmm. And so if I keep bidding, I could get into trouble by letting you get a real good deal, maybe on a better plant that I'm bidding on. On the other hand, if I let you have it, it might flip a turkey that I don't even want. And here, the plant that we both needed to give ourselves a chances to win, you paid a lot, but you got it. And I passed and I didn't get it. And a lot of things that you have to think about to decide, should I keep bidding or should I not keep bidding? There are many, many decisions in Power Grid. Many of them are tactical, but I think the key to strategic decision is how high do you bid on that plant that you really want?
Yeah.
And, it's a game of luck, because really neither of us know in most cases, unless hypothetically there's only one plant left in the deck and we've been counting the deck, which generally I don't do. Unless there's only one left, we don't know what plant's going to come out. It could be a good one or a bad one. Well, do you feel lucky? And but that's kind of a nice thing that the game has that uncertainty. It's not purely calculable.
Right. No, I would agree with you there, and I have seen players do that, saving their money. My wife is one that is particularly loath to ever spend money. She really is rather frugal in real life, thank goodness, because, she runs the finances, and, if it was up to me, I'd probably spend way too much money. But also in gaming life, she is very, very frugal and tight with her money. And so sometimes I've seen her pass on things and let things go in the manner that you're describing, thinking she's going to get a bargain, but it doesn't always pan out that way. I also have to say that most of my plays of Power Grid, and this may be why my perception of the game is skewed towards money and how important money is in the game, is most of my games have been played with a player who's a friend of ours, and she just has the unique ability to at any time tell you how much money you have. So we have a table of 5 people, and she can just look and say, you have $84, she has $78, he has $56, and she just knows. Like, you can't hide it from her. It actually became like a bit of a game within the game to try to make it so Stacy couldn't tell how much money we all had, and she just has a brain that can do that. And so it made the auctions that much more difficult because she always knew what I had. It's like there was no real way to sort of bluff or looking at the other player and saying, I wonder how much they have. Are they really going to commit that much? If they spend that much on that plant, they're not even going to have enough money to buy the fuel for it, and it's going to sit there. Well, she knew. So, because she could look and look at the market, look at the power plants, and math that out in her head almost instantly. So it made for us the auctions really, really tense because you're playing with someone who is able to do that and kind of had that advantage. So that may have skewed my perception of how important money is in the game, because basically what you're telling me, Eric, is that old sort of adage: you got to spend money to make money. And, letting a power plant go can sometimes work to your advantage, but often, if you don't buy a plant, you're definitely going to lose. If you don't ever upgrade to a plant that can power 4 or 5 cities or more, you're not. I think the biggest one is 6 or 7. That a single plant can power. 7, yeah. If you don't ever get those larger plants, you just really are going to have no chance to win, because I think the most you can have, if my memory serves me, is 4, yeah? Is it 4 plants?
3 plants except with 3 plants except for a 2-player game.
Okay.
Where you can have 4.
All right, so maybe I'm thinking 4 because I also have played a 2-player. So yeah, it really becomes extremely important to upgrade your plants and spend the money on it, and still have enough money to power them so that you can get money for the next auction, and so that you have the ability to buy the fuel that you need. So there's a whole lot going on in this game, and it's one of the things that I think makes it challenging, but not incomprehensible. And that goes back to the point that you were making, which is once the game is flowing, it's pretty straightforward and pretty simple. My earlier comment, though, Eric, had to do with the initial setup of the game, knowing when the markets are going to shift and change, and because that has an effect on how many of each type of resource refills in the market. There is a gradual shift towards, usually, not on every map, but usually towards more renewable, more trash, more recyclables, and more nuclear as the game goes on, and less coal. So there's this sort of shift, and you have to kind of keep track of that. But I think if you have an experienced player, like you're talking about, sort of running that and keeping an eye on that, with that little handy chart in the back of the rule book, I think it does play pretty intuitively and simply as the game evolves. Again, you only have a few things that you can do in the game. You're either going to extend your network, or not. You're going to buy a plant, or you're not. You're going to buy the resources to power the plant, or you're not. There's not a whole lot of extraneous stuff going on there. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, there is some definite attractiveness to the renewable power plants in game terms, because you don't have to provide them with fuel. What is your take on the strategic value of the renewable plants? Because I've seen people try to go almost all renewable as much as they can, and I've also talked to players who said they're a waste of time. What are your thoughts on those?
Well, I have a couple of things to say based on what you said, but it will lead to an answer to what you said. The first thing I would say is I'm a pretty strong player in this game. I won the World Board Gaming Championship twice. I had some good luck, but I never make any effort to memorize exactly how much money everybody has.
Right.
And if I knew that somebody else could do that, I would know that that was a small advantage to them. But I don't think of it's a big advantage in the sense that, either it's worth paying for the plant or it isn't. And if it's worth paying for it, I should keep bidding, thinking about the things that you said. And if it's not worth, I should stop. And, I need to know how much money I have. And usually I can figure that out by counting it. Sometimes I might count it wrong. And if I were going to count anything, and maybe sometimes in a tournament I will try to do this, I would count what power plants I've seen and what power plants I haven't seen in the deck. Now, in a 3 or 4 player game, you remove some plants at random, so it's hard to know. But you're talking about the player you play with who has, that eidetic ability to remember money. And I guess I would think if she were remembering every plant, I would worry more about her than if she could count all your money. Okay. Maybe she doesn't have that skill, or maybe she just applies her skill to a different thing. And the second thing I would say is I play a lot of it. I think I've probably played about 130 games of this in person and a bunch of other games online when I was playing games online. And more often than not, when I've won, it's because I kept bidding on a plant that was really important and the other person stopped too soon. Now, it can happen the other way, but I would say the run-of-the-mill gamer doesn't bid enough for plants. And what plant am I going to bid a lot for? It's almost always a plant that's going to allow me to power a lot of cities. If I can buy a plant that powers 7, 6, or even 5 in the mid-game, I'm going to pay a lot for that if I can possibly find a way to do it. It just eliminates problems later on. So this leads to an answer about your question about windmills. The windmills are really powerful in the beginner game, the one that only goes to phase 1. And, some people might start, and I understand that with a beginner game, and the windmills are quite good there. But the problem with windmills is they just don't power very many cities. And if I'm trying to get capacity to power 15 or 17 cities, and there's a nice 2-city windmill and a 3-city windmill, it's hard to get to 15 or 17 adding 2s, 3s, and 4s up when you only get to have 3 of them. So I will not try to buy windmills except in a few limited circumstances. One is if I get a pretty good sized windmill early in the game. Let's say I can get the 27 that powers 3 cities or the 33 that powers 4 in the second round or the third round. I might jump on it just because it's going to pay off so much, and the fact that it's pretty small doesn't hurt. I'm talking, by the way, about the standard deck, and I'm sorry, Jeff, I have all the plants memorized.
Right, no, not a problem.
That deck. There's a new deck, and I don't have them memorized for there. So if you play me, you probably want to play with a new deck. But the thing is, I'm looking for a plant that will power a lot. So I love to get the 25 or 26 plants. Those power 5 cities each for 2 coal or 2 oil. I'm all over those plants because 5 is an endgame plant. 4 might be an endgame plant if you get 2 other good ones. So if you have a 7, 6, and a 4, that's 17. But a 5 is a real solid endgame plant. And even if I have to buy it and not really power it, in this game, in keeping with the German public utility theme, if you power no cities, you get 10 electros. Because I guess, in Germany, if you make too much money, they're suspicious. But if you don't make any money, they want to help you. And so, even if you spend a lot of money on that plant, you're going to get some money. You might find that you can't power anything for a turn. In certain circumstances, you might be just fine doing that. So the windmill that comes out that's a big windmill early, and, maybe even the 18 that powers 2 cities might count in some circumstances. The other thing is, some games you can look at the map and you can kind of see that there might be a stall waiting for what's called phase 2, when people can build a second connection to someone else's city. At the beginning of the game, only one person can build into each city. And, sometimes you get in this position where nobody wants to end that stall, and then you sort of have this protracted phase where you're all buying fuel and paying and running your plants, but you're not really building. And a windmill can be useful there. So if I think a stall is coming, I might try to buy a windmill to give me a little economic advantage in the stall. But I'm not mostly trying to buy windmills. I'm mostly trying to buy big plants.
Well, thanks for sharing those strategy tips. That was kind of my experience as well. And it's funny because, as you said, it's all about making sure, if possible, that you have plants that can power 15 or more cities. And the renewables don't often do that. So I agree with you. And I think that that's an important distinction to point out, because I know the initial attraction of those plants is that you're not going to have to pay in order to power, in order to provide power. You're not going to have to get involved in that market, and people are going to be spending money, and you're not. And so, you think this is a win. The only caveat that I would add to your analysis of it is that I have found in the sort of mid-game there, right before you move into phase 2, as you talked about, those are valuable because they allow me to save up money so that I can then have the cash that I need to get into the cities as the secondary market. Because, as you said, in the first part of the game, only one person can get into each city. And I believe the base cost for the cities is 10. And then there's also a connection cost associated with it. And that is somewhat terrain dependent based upon the map. However, in the next phase, I believe the price jumps to 15, and then I think it ends at 20, if I'm not mistaken. So if I can accumulate cash in the early game before we make that switch, that can sometimes allow me to make a very rapid expansion very early in that second phase, getting into cities that I need to get into or that I want to get into because of board considerations and places I'm trying to go. So would you agree that that's a viable strategy to use those for? Or again, is that just my inexperience showing compared to someone who's played it as much as you have?
Well, that certainly can be a strategy, and that's what causes the stall, is everybody thinking like you, and sometimes they're all right, although probably one of them shouldn't be doing it.
Okay.
But sometimes somebody will rush phase 2 because they see that you're doing that, and they think that it's not going to help, and they're in a better position. I would say that, building cities is great, but it's also dangerous because it makes you first in the turn order. And when you're the first in the turn order, you don't really get the best choice of power plants.
Right.
It also hurts you with fuel buying, but the big issue is power plants. And so you have to think about your situation. If you have good power plants, then maybe it makes sense, Jeff, and you think, well, I might not get power plants for a while, but I already got mine. But if your power plants need upgrading, then you'd better be careful about building too many cities.
Right,
and,
right.
You kind of have to balance this. This is the wonderful things is all the parts of the game kind of integrate with each other, and it takes experience to know how the decision you make in one area is going to affect the decision in another area.
Right.
And you gave earlier the example of you're running the only coal plant where other people are running oil plants. Especially in a 3 or 4 player game where some of the plants are thrown out of the game, as you do the early part of the game, there's all these really big plants that you don't have any chance at, and they're just tucked under the deck each turn. But you can watch those and say, are those oil plants or coal plants? And if you see a lot of oil plants, then the odds are that there are more oil plants and fewer coal plants. No guarantee, but then that means that when you look ahead towards the end of the game and you think about what resources there might be a shortage of, you have a little information, and that's going to affect how you bid on the plants that you do bid on. I think a lot of players just say, well, I can't bid on those plants anyway. I'm not going to pay any attention to them.
Right.
But they're giving you information for later in the game.
Yeah, and that's a really good finer point of strategy. I appreciate you sharing that, and again, that's one of the reasons I'm very happy to be able to talk with you about this, because you're bringing up things that are things I haven't even considered, and that's certainly one of them. You also reminded me of just how important turn order is, and the actual brilliance in the design in that first goes last kind of thing, because I'd kind of completely forgotten about that. I haven't played it in a little while, and yes, there is a huge advantage to trying to be, most of the time I've found it's to my advantage to try to be in last place as long as I possibly can before I make my move. And it's one of the only complaints I have about the game, which is that the game sort of seems to get to a state where everyone is kind of, you can tell, sort of getting ready for that final push. And sometimes it seems like it ends a little abruptly, considering the amount of time that I've invested in the game. When somebody makes that last big push, signals that final round, and then it's over. I had talked with you and Joe a little bit about the end game, and Joe seemed to indicate that he thought Funkenschlag was a little bit more satisfying in the end game, to him, to his taste, in that it didn't seem to have that abrupt ending. What was your opinion on that? Do you find the end game in this sometimes seems to feel a little rushed, or are you happy with it?
Well, first I will say that I don't think that hanging at the back is always the right strategy. I think that this game, you can have pretty good players whose strategies aren't quite right. And if you play a game, especially in a group where all of you sort of are skewed a little bit suboptimally, you can find that one strategy seems to win. I think what you would find in most of those cases, let's say you're in a group that always hangs back in turn order, I think you would find that a really good player would show you that your strategy isn't as good as you think. I think that, if you're going to go first in turn order, you just have to make sure that you got something worthwhile out of it in terms of the cities that you built. And sometimes it's worth it. And whether it's worth it depends on a lot of things, like where is the fuel supply and what plants do you have? And, if I have some plants that have fuel needs that aren't overlapping with my opponent's fuel needs, then I can go to first in turn order a little bit more cheerfully because I'm not worried so much about buying plants and buying fuel. On the other hand, if I'm fighting with my opponents for plants and fuel, then I got to hang back. And so I think I see it as a push and pull. If you look at this game, it's not simply an economic game, but it's also a political game. Friedman is a German, and German politics is a politics of compromise and thinking about the other person and not pushing yourself forward too much different from U.S. politics. And you have to understand that the game sort of punishes somebody who looks too obviously like a leader. That probably fits the German politics. And so I think it's kind of thematic. So that's one comment I would say is sometimes I try to hang back. If you could buy either the 31 or the 32 plant, you're probably better off with the 31, all else being equal, because that means you'll go after the person with the 32. People don't think about that. But you asked the question about the end of the game. Certainly it's the case that Funkenschlag has a much more protracted game end. And Power Grid, often the game takes 1 or 2 turns after you get to phase 3. And I sort of missed that longer game end. But, Jeff, do you remember when we were talking about 18XX and you asked me about that end game phase where everything was kind of decided and we're just playing it out?
Right.
And you asked me if that bugged me? Well, I think what Friedman did here was, as soon as it started to become clear who's the leader and who's the trailer, all of a sudden the game ends. And I realized that that's a feature. Whereas in Funkenschlag, you can be hopelessly behind, you're not going to win, and now we got to play 5 more turns. In Power Grid, by the time you realize you're not going to win, you probably don't have more than 2 turns left, unless you've really gotten yourself into a big hole.
Right.
And so this game kind of ends the game in a hurry once you figured out who's going to be in contention with the win. Usually there's not one player who's guaranteed to win. That could happen, but sometimes you're playing a 4 or 5 player game and there's 2 or 3 people who have a real shot at it, and there's somebody who's not. And that's kind of why I elevated my view of Power Grid, is I realized that ending a game quickly once you know sort of who's in contention is actually a feature and not a bug.
That's a really interesting point, because I've heard that complaint so often about 18XX style games, and I've also struggled with that in my own game design, trying to not make the very end of the game just sort of spinning out the math and seeing who it is that's going to win. So looking at it from that perspective, I think that is actually something that resonates with me a little bit. This idea that, by the time that becomes clear, it's over, and maybe it should be over. So I appreciate you sharing that sort of philosophical look at it, because that does sort of change my perspective on the end of the game there. So thanks for sharing that. Eric, the final question that I wanted to ask you about Power Grid this evening myself was about player count. Because as I started describing the game in the early part of our discussion here, I said that I had played it quite a few times 2-player and found it rather unsatisfying, except with the Italy map, and that I generally enjoyed it with the higher player counts of like 4, 5, or 6. What has been your experience with player count? What would you consider to be the best player count? And do you feel that any of the maps are good with a smaller player count, whether it be 2 or 3 players? Or do you really think that this is a game that needs to be played with more than 2 players? What are your thoughts on that?
I would never pick this game with 2 players, just because there's a lot of good 2-player games I like. I'm pretty happy with it with 3, 4, 5, or 6. I have a system. I teach the game, I run the game, and remind people what's the next phase. But another thing I do is I give out jobs. I find this helps. I say to somebody, okay, you're going to be in charge of the fuel restocking. And I say to somebody else, you're going to be in charge of keeping the number of cities that we all have built updated. And I manage the power plant deck myself because that's the hard job. And when everybody has a job, it keeps them kind of engaged. And I think we can finish a game with any number of players in 90 minutes. So it's not a length of game thing. I think 4 and 5 are probably the best player counts. 6, you only have to play to 14. That's a little quick. But 3, I'm happy with. It's a little bit, a little bit more swingy because you take 8 plants out of the deck. And there's a lot of fiddliness in this, as you mentioned, Jeff. People might play with 3 and forget to take 8 plants out of the deck, and that's going to lead to a game that doesn't work very well.
Right.
But I'm not strongly biased against it with any number. Certainly, for example, the Benelux map works with fewer players. But I like the different maps mainly because of the different rules. One that people might not know very much about is the Funkenschlag ENBW map set. It's actually not an expansion. It's a standalone game that was commissioned by the Baden-Württemberg Power Company, ENBW. And it's in a blue box, unlike almost all of Friedemann Friese's other boxes. And it has 2 or 3 simple rule changes that actually make the game simpler. And I think when ENBW commissioned it, they probably said to Friedemann, could you make it a little bit simpler? And for example, in the regular game, you have the rearrangement of turn order at the beginning of each turn, except on the first turn when it's after the auction. Well, in ENBW, you always have the rearrangement after the auction, so the rules can just say your rearranged turn order after the auction. Right? It's a tiny little thing, but it makes it a little simpler, and it makes your entire auction strategy different. And
Right.
it has a couple of other things. I don't know how easy that is to get. At first, it was very hard to get. Then it became a little easier, and I think it was published on the back of another map recently. So I recommend ENBW if people want to try a specific one. It also works pretty well with small player counts.
Well, fantastic. Thanks for that tip. I appreciate that because I'm always looking for something that, might make the game a little bit simpler for me to introduce people to, but also a map that's going to work well with the smaller player count. So thanks for that tip, and I'll be on the lookout for that. Well, Eric, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your insights and your expertise on this game of Power Grid. It's clearly a game that you enjoy. That comes through in how you describe the game. It is clearly a game that you have a lot of skill with, given your WBC championships. That's certainly nothing to sneeze at. Those competitions are quite fierce, and I really do enjoy the game, and I've really gotten a lot out of listening to you talk about the different sort of elements and strategies, which I'm really thinking will be something that'll be useful to people who are listening to this episode. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts tonight on the Friedemann Friese game of Power Grid.
Jeff, I can't resist saying one more thing, which is, Friedemann recently came out with a game called Copycat, where he took elements of various games. And, some designers claim that they never play games by other designers, and I think that's kind of a foolish thing, but Friedemann plainly plays games and enjoys them with other designers. But I thought I would mention that Power Grid took some elements from other games, and I thought I'd mention, just for people's reference, how that is. The first one is Empire Builder, or the Crayon Rails games, where you take a crayon and you draw connections to cities. And Friedemann used that in Funkenschlag, where you also take a crayon and draw connections to other cities. In Power Grid, of course, you're just placing houses. He decided crayons are kind of messy and people don't like them, so he made it simpler. But I do think that, if I remember correctly, him saying that on the U.S. map, he actually got an Empire Builder map and kind of counted out how much it would cost to build from one city to another, and that's how he developed the cost. So he borrowed from Crayon Rails in some way. Obviously, he didn't make it the same, but he adapted that. You mentioned the fuel market in Power Grid, which I agree is a great mechanism. I think he kind of took that from Crude or McMulti, which is a game from the 70s,
Yep.
where you have a similar type of power fuel market. So he he adopted that mechanism from Crude or McMulty. It's possible that these mechanisms came from yet some other place, but that's where I think of it. And then finally, another favorite game of mine, Outpost, which came out in 1991, had 3 phases, and there were different rules in each phase. There was a phase 1, 2, and 3, and you had different upgrades, and the better ones became available later. And you can see that in Funkenschlag and in Power Grid, you have 3 phases, and so he's sort of integrated mechanisms from these 3 sources at least. There may be others, and he put his own spin on all of them, and he made a game that's kind of a great new creation. Some people think innovation is making something that nobody ever has heard of anything about before. Oftentimes, innovation means taking mechanisms that are already in the air, or that people already know about, but taking something from here and something from there and putting them together to make something new that really takes advantage of them. And that's what he's done here. I admire that about him. I really like the fact that he does that.
Well, I can clearly see the connections now that you have illustrated them. I have Crude, the oil game, and that's one that I've played a bit, and that had that foreign and domestic market for gasoline and oil. And, as soon as you said that, I'm like, yeah, it does kind of feel like that a little bit, and how that market works. And, I think that's a valuable words of encouragement for people who are interested in game design, because I think there is that sort of pressure that people feel that they need to come up with the next great thing or the next new thing. And as I said earlier, everything old is new again, and the pendulum swings. And I like your definition of innovation as being taking something perhaps that has been done before, but using it in a different way or in an unexpected way. So I appreciate you sharing that with us here tonight as we talked about the game of Power Grid.
And now it's time for a new game review. Join us for a quick look here on The Long View.
Tonight, Eric and I are going to be discussing a new game in the 18XX series, and this game is 1862, Railway Mania in the Eastern Counties. This game was just released in 2013. It is listed that it plays from 2 to 8 players, and the designer is listed as Mike Hutton. And when I saw this game, I had noticed a couple of threads from people that are sort of in my Board Game Geek sort of friends list, my geek friends, and they had talked about it and were very excited about it. And I thought, who better to talk about the latest 18XX title than either Eric or Joe? So I wanted to take advantage of having Eric on the show this evening and ask him if he could tell us a little bit about this brand new offering in the 18XX series. Eric, have you had a chance to play this? And if so, what have been your impressions of it?
Yes, I have had a chance to play it. A bunch of us in the Boston area got together, and I actually kickstarted my first ever Kickstarter. I made an order for 5 copies, and then distributed them out to the different people in the group. So a number of my friends have it, and I've had a chance to play it 5 times now. One of those times I got sick halfway through, so I've started the game 5 times and I've finished it 4. I've only played it with 3 or 4 players, but I don't doubt that it would work with the other numbers. It's something like Mike Hutton's other design, 1860, which also is reputed to work well with 2, but it's simpler, I think. And people seem to be excited about it. The only way that I could play 5 times in 3 months or less is that people keep saying, let's play again, 1862. And I even had somebody send me an email say, could we come over and play it some Saturday this month? So we've got a scheduled session for a future Saturday. And it has a lot of things that are different from normal 18XX games. And sometimes those differences lead seasoned 18XX players to say, oh, this game's hard, it's different. But as I think about it, many of those differences are things that aren't going to be an issue to new players because they don't know what the custom is. And so the fact that the custom is not followed isn't going to matter as much to them. For example, I'll mention that in most 18xx games, a company can only run one train on each piece of track. In 1862, you can run multiple trains on the same piece of track.
Oh, wow.
And I guess if I were talking to, a person off the street and say, when you build a track, is there only one train that can run on it? They say, well, no, that's silly. A railroad has signals and you can run multiple trains on a track. Well, that happens in 1862. But another thing that happens in 1862 is you can only score each city or revenue location once. So, whereas in many 18xx games, if you can run 4 separate trains to Chicago, you can satisfy Chicago's demand 4 times, and that seems a little odd too. In 1862, you can only score each revenue location once. So some real differences. But on the other hand, if you're new to it, it might not be a bad starting point. The other thing I will say is when we did our podcast on this, Jeff, I said one of the problems is it's hard to find the games you want that are actually available. And this game is actually available. You can buy it. If you think you might be interested in 18xx, I'll bet that in 6 months or a year, you won't be able to get this one and you'll have to buy it on, Geek Auctions or eBay for large prices. I'm not a prophet, but I'd be really surprised if you bought this game and you couldn't sell it in a couple of years if you needed to sell it for more than you bought it for. It is not cheap, but 18xx games are never cheap. I paid $98.74 a copy for mine, including shipping, and I don't know whether you can get it much cheaper than that. It might even be more. But it's a game with a lot of components. It's got 20 companies. Another benefit of it is it has a varied start, so the start is randomized. In some 18xx games, you kind of know what the moves are. Here, you can't know what the moves are because every game is different. I think somebody computed how many billion or trillion different setups there could be in this game. And, the game has some financial things that happen, but you can't go bankrupt in this game because you as the president are never required to buy a train for your company. Now, that could be good or bad, but, sometimes if you're new, going bankrupt is a little bit of a disappointing experience. And you avoid that in this game. Another thing I would say is I think it's a pretty short game. My estimate is my group, which is a pretty fast group, but we're going to be playing this game in 3 hours or less. We just played a game with 4 players on, I guess it was last night, and it took us 3 hours. And we'll be faster in the future. Other players in other groups may take longer, but it's shorter than many 18xx games. So there's a lot to be said for it.
Well, you've said a few things that already intrigue me, which is that it is purported to work with 2 players, which I actually own the 1860 game, which is Railways on the Isle of Wight. And I got that specifically because supposedly it was one of the few 18x titles that works with 2 players. And so if this one also will work with 2 players, I think that's fantastic. You had given me some advice saying that, you might want to hold on to that 1860 and wait until you have a chance to, play it with someone who knows the game because it is, a little bit complicated. So it seems to me as though you're indicating that this one is not only available, but that it is perhaps a little bit simpler than 1860, or, is that not necessarily the point you were trying to make?
I think this one is a little simpler for new players than 1860 for a number of reasons. I don't know if I can, we have time for me to enumerate them all. But, for example, 1860 starts with an auction. And an auction is always discouraging if you're a new player. How much am I going to bid?
Right.
This game has an auction option. There's a parliament round where you can essentially bribe members of parliament to let you get the right to start a given railroad. But if you're brand new players, you could just say, we're going to skip the parliament rounds in this game, and we're just going to start companies as non-chartered companies, and the game will work just fine. Now, after you do that once or twice, you might say, wait a minute, the first player has an advantage. We see what that advantage is. What could we do about it? Then I'd say, okay, then put the parliament rounds back in, and if you don't like them to get the advantage, you bid for the company you want and take that option out of their hand.
Right.
Sometimes a game has some sort of a mechanism which is designed to present some sort of imbalance or unfair play, And if you're new and you have no idea what it's preventing, it just seems like complication. So I think certainly a reasonable approach in this game would just be to check the Parliament rounds, play it without them, and by the time you figure out why you need them, it will require some learning and some development of strategies before you need them. And then you say, okay, now we know why we have them, we'll put them back in.
Right. No, that's an excellent point, and I'm glad that the system is flexible and allows that, because any of those games that I've played, and I'm talking about games that are even as simple as Chicago Express. When you have that initial auction, it's so hard to sort of tell as a new player, what value should I put on a company? How much of my money, how much capital should I spend right off the bat on, these different railroad companies? And so I agree that can be a particularly daunting thing for a new player to try to figure out what would be an appropriate bid and what really they should do. So I think if this game allows you to take that out and then put it back in, I think that sounds fantastic. I also am hanging my hat on a statement you made a little bit ago, which is the game does not allow you to go bankrupt. And I know with Age of Steam and a lot of 18xx games, you can, just go bankrupt and then you're pretty much out. You're done. So I think that not having that be part of the game sounds like, again, something that would encourage people to try it and encourage them to continue to explore it without that sort of frustration that can happen when you get knocked out of a game. So all of those things sound fantastic to me. You said that this game is set in England, yes? In a particular location. Is there any thematic tie-in to the location as far as either, terrain or goods that are being offered or things that are going on? You mentioned this sort of bribery sort of round with the Parliament. That sounds kind of thematic to me. Are there other sort of connections to this particular time and location that this game brings out?
Yes, and in fact, the designer has a fairly extensive description of the railway era, and not just technically, but kind of how different characters got involved, some of them operating in a shady manner. But the area that's covered is the part northeast of London, Norfolk and Suffolk counties. It's sort of a part of England that kind of hangs out there into the North Sea. And, at the southwest corner of the board is London, which is worth a whole lot more than any of the cities that are on the board. It takes some effort to connect to London. And then you have some ports, and you have some connections to the rest of England. And you pretty clearly see in this game that all the places that are not this part of the country, they're all richer than this. So you get the impression of a poor part of England, and it was a flat country. I don't know if you have ever read Dorothy Sayers' novel, The Nine Tailors, her mystery about
No.
Lord Peter Wimsey, and that was set in this part of the world, in the Fens, and so it's a flat country. There's not really building costs, and so in some sense that also makes track building much simpler than it would be even in 1860, and so you see this. The real way to make money is not to necessarily just spend all your effort driving goods around within the map. It's to either get them from off the map and bring them in, or take them from where you are and take them off the map. Or almost the best scoring routes are the ones that you land in a port and then you drive them a route across the map and you take them to London. And you think, well, that didn't deliver anything to this part of the map. And the answer is it's a poor part of the world. So that's kind of thematic, but it also leads to really much simpler tile laying. Tile laying is something that seems irritating to people. You have to think about your tile lays, but it's not very complicated in this game.
Good. Yeah, that's another thing that's, if the track building sort of costs and calculating that has been simplified because of the natural geography of the area, I think that's another great point to the game as well. Well, Eric, I haven't had a chance to play this, but you definitely have me intrigued. And maybe if I can meet up with you in Boston next year, we'll see if we can maybe get this one played, because it sounds like your recommendation is get this one now while it's available. And, you find this game to be a great entry point for 18xx. Is there enough there, though, Eric, for seasoned kind of players like yourself and Joe and others that are used to these these games? Is there enough meat there for you, or is this more of a sort of a beginner's kind of 18xx game as you've been describing?
This is not just a beginner's game. I would not put myself out as an expert. One of the people I know that may be one of the best 18xx players in the world wrote a little report. Bruce Beard, he's won the WCBC tournament 10 times.
Wow.
And he went to some convention recently. He wrote a report. He said he's played 16 18xx games over the however many days he was there, and 12 of them were 1862. So,
right.
When an experienced player decides to play the same game 12 times at a convention, you figure there must be something there. It seems like a game with a lot of possibilities and a lot of room for subtle play, but I should clarify, Jeff, that when I said you can play the game without Parliament rounds, that's not something that the designer suggests. That's
right.
my own suggestion. But, if you play without Parliament rounds, you'll start in a stock round, and somebody will say, I'm going to start that company, and you'll put some money in, and then you'll run it, and you'll see what happens. And somebody else will start a different company, and then you'll find out how it goes. And then the second time you'll say, well, I tried one strategy. I think I'm going to try a different strategy next time. And then you'll try that, and that's where the stage I'm really still at, is trying different things. And I played a game just last week, I think, where one player decided, I'm not going to start a railroad. I'm just going to judiciously buy stock in everybody else's railroads. And usually in an 18xx game that doesn't work. But he won the game by a narrow margin. He did, I think, start a railroad late in the game. But it was kind of cool to think, there's a lot of people in the economy that don't run companies. They just buy stocks. And it's nice that, at least in some circumstances, that worked. Maybe if we were better, he wouldn't have gotten away with it. But it was kind of cool.
Well, it's always a good thing when there's more options in a game. I always like it when there's alternate paths to victory. I think it just adds more variety. The other thing that stands out to me about what you said was the variety and the game setup. That usually leads to a game that's going to offer a lot of replayability, and so that it doesn't get rote. Sounds like this game has a lot going for it, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. I haven't played it yet. Would you give this your official thumbs up for people out there who are interested in this style of game, Eric?
I give it a thumbs up. I've played it 5 times in less than 3 months. I think the only other game I've played that much in such a short amount of time from the 18xx series is 1846, which of course I give a thumbs up, but is not easily available. This one's available. And, I guess my hope is that people go out and buy it and play it, enjoy it, sell it out, and then they need a new printing and they make a new printing. I don't know if that'll happen, but you can get one right now. I think the guy that distributes them said that they've sold out 70% of the initial printing and 30% are left. So, in less than 3 months, they sold 70%. Obviously, Kickstarter was a big part of that. But
Right. Well, I appreciate you taking your time to tell us about that game here on A Quick Look from the Long View. And thank you for sharing your expertise. And so, for Eric Brocious and myself, I want to say, thanks to everyone out there who is listening. Thanks, of course, to my sponsor, GameSurplus.com. They are a fantastic resource. They are the ones who tracked down 1860 for me. I don't know if they can track this one down. I think this was a little more limited of a distribution from a particular individual, but you never know. If you ask Thor, he might be able to find it for you at GameSurplus.com. I also, of course, want to thank the Dice Tower Network. We are a proud member of the Dice Tower Network, and I encourage everyone to go and check out the other great podcasts in the Dice Tower. Go to Dicetower.com for that. And, of course, I want to give another shout-out to my new local game store, the Gamer's Edge in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. If you're in the northeastern Pennsylvania area or in northern New Jersey, or perhaps you're coming to visit to do a little bit of skiing that we have to offer up here in northeast PA, I'd encourage you to go to Main Street in Stroudsburg and check out all that the Gamer's Edge has to offer. Their board game collection is growing daily. They add about anywhere from 20 to 30 new titles a week. They are aggressively expanding into the board game market while continuing to offer full-fledged full-fledged services for Magic the Gathering, comic books, role-playing games, just about anything you can imagine is there for you at Gamer's Edge in Main Street in Stroudsburg. So for Eric Brocious and myself, I want to say thanks to everyone out there again for listening, and have a great night.